right, well, welcome everyone to the fall workshop from the NWS FLYERS. Glad you could join us tonight. Tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different than what we have in the previous two workshops. In the previous two workshops, we kind of talked about seasonal aviation hazards, kind of from a broad perspective. Tonight, we're going to kind of channel our focus a little bit more on a particular hazard, one that's very costly and unfortunately deadly at times, and that being IFR potential and the ways to mitigate that, ways to be aware of that. And we wanted to take a little bit deeper dive into one topic versus kind of a broad overview of many. So we've got several presenters tonight that's going to be sharing some information with us. Paul Suffern, he is a meteorologist with the NTSB. He's got a good case for us that he's going to be walking through. We'll kick it off with him, then turn it over to Mark Boguski. He's the chief flight instructor and a recent recipient of the WRN Ambassador of Excellence Award. And we'll talk a little bit about the Weather Ready Nation program and how you can become a part of that if you're interested. And then we've got a few presenters from the NWS FLYERS, and they'll be talking about some fog potential forecasting and avoidance methods and how you can be aware of those hazards. And if you have any questions, feel free to chat those in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we'll kind of collect those and answer those at the end with any of the presenters as we go through. So, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll get started. Thank you all for coming tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Screen is shared. Is it popping up okay for everybody?
Yeah, we see it, Paul. I'm good to go.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come to this event and just share some accident examples and things like that have been weather related that have definitely highlighted some issues with instrument meteorological conditions or IMC. The perspective that I'll be taking, so I'm a meteorologist with the NTSB. We have 3 meteorologists that work there. And so a lot of my accident examples will be showing and highlighting particular weather areas. But as with any investigation, there's definitely a human factors side, there's an operations side, air traffic frequently, and lots of different other reports. And so I'm going to be sharing kind of a weather piece and a little bit from the pilot side. But as I'm going through my accident examples, I definitely want to highlight the areas where pilots can see themselves going through these scenarios and ways to mitigate those things. And I don't want to in any way, shape, or form disparage any of the pilots that got into these accidents. Any of these scenarios could be one of us as well. And so just making sure to stay safe in many different aspects. And so so I'll kind of step through some scenarios and push it along to the other presenters because I know they have some great material as well. So one of the biggest things that we see from our weather-related accidents at the NTSB, and over the course of the year, it's about 25 to 30% of our accidents are weather-related. As you can see from the graph on this screen, most of those weather-related accidents are wind, and typically are not fatal, thankfully, but that's landing with a tailwind, a crosswind, gusty winds, things like that. But if we go down to ceiling visibility and precipitation, where you see the fatal rate goes up quite a bit, and light condition, and that's where we're dealing with visual flight rules or VFR and to IMC, or even sometimes IFR qualified pilots that may not be current and things like that. But you'll be doing a cross country, and then all of a sudden you'll be doing it, done it 30 times in the daytime, and this first time you've done it at night or near sunset or sunrise, and then some low clouds form or some fog or things like that. So those are kind of some of the scenarios. And as you'll see in the accident examples I have today, unfortunately, it's typically not just one weather-related issue that gets pilots and others into trouble. It's IMC, and then you throw in ice, or you throw in precipitation, or many things like that. And so I'll step through these different scenarios here. This first one happened in Texas, near Houston area, Katy, Texas. It was a VFR flight following flight part 91. It was going from El Paso to Houston, to an airport just west of Houston there. And the pilot and a passenger had actually delayed their trip, their VFR cross-country flight, a couple of days to get a better weather window. But they departed from the West Coast, landed in El Paso the day before, and then were planning to move on to Houston. The pilot in this particular case had just around 250 hours or so. Did get a weather briefing from Lido's flight service there, and through that course of conversation was provided a lot of weather material. And there was some precipitation in the Houston area, as well as air mets and several other things, and therefore the Lido's flight service person said, VFR is not recommended. Unfortunately led to the fatality of the pilot in this case. And as you can see on the bottom of the screen, I have the METAR for the closest site to the accident site. And you can see about 2.5 miles, light rain and overcast at 900. The temperature and dew point is definitely something to note as well, as they were very similar there at 14. So very moist there in the Houston area. So here's kind of an overview chart of the Texas region and Southern Plains. The station models are the circles with the little wind barbs out there, and then you can see areas where there's rain highlighted with the accident area, which is circled in red. The general flight path there is the red or the black dashed line from northwest to southeast, going from El Paso area down into Houston area. There's a little bit of a trough there, or an area kind of a little weakness or low pressure down in the southern Texas area, which was helping, is very conducive for cloud cover and precipitation, and that was slowly moving northeastward throughout the day. So in this particular case, the pilot received weather briefing close to noon on the day of the accident, discussing the air mets over the area. With the precipitation was south of Houston at the time of the briefing, but was forecast to move northeastward. And the briefer told VFR not recommended based on the air met, as well as the Sugar Land TAF, which is the closest airport with a terminal aerodrome forecast, or a TAF. It did have ceilings going from marginal of VFR, so between about 1,000 to 3,000 feet, down below 1,000 feet. And the pilot with Lidos there was saying they would check precipitation trends and get an update once they were in flight. And unfortunately, after they encountered the clouds and precipitation, as they got closer to Houston, their turns became quite a bit more erratic and appear to be a little bit more spatially disoriented. And this graphic is kind of the last few minutes of the flight. You can see over on the left middle part of the screen is the proposed airport that the pilot was going to. You can see they overflew the airport, I believe, between about 2,000 and 3,000 feet or so. And you can see the flight track is definitely not a very constant, definitely erratic. And as they were making that northward turn, they hit some cabling and a tower there as they were going northward. Here's a visible satellite animation, and hopefully with the bandwidth is coming across okay, but you can see quite a bit of it's nice flying weather there in central and west Texas up to the Panhandle area, but down across Houston and in central and southeastern Texas, you can see quite a bit more cloud cover. You can kind of, as you're looping it, you can see two distinct areas of cloud cover. You can kind of see the lower cloud cover, which seems a little bit more flat, and up in Oklahoma has a few waves in it. But over the Houston area, you can see definitely a little bit more bubbly and cumulus clouds. So definitely a lot more vertical development. Cloud tops this particular day were between 30 and 40,000 feet or so. So quite extensive precipitation moving across the area. And this is one of the things I definitely want to highlight to the pilots out there, is when you're looking at imagery, whether it's satellite or radar or anything, please absolutely loop it. If you're just looking at one static image, it's not going to necessarily tell you the full picture of where that cloud cover is moving, how that fog is dissipating, or how it's maybe increasing over the area, or things like that. So looping imagery is definitely very helpful. So this following images and a series of images kind of show the flight track, which is in pink as it's moving east-southeastward. The black circle is the accident site, and then I'll step through different locations. If you look at the flight track, from this about 350 or so, and then to the northwest, you can see it's a much more consistent flight track, and this was the case all the way from El Paso, but from this 350 time location and all the way to the accident site, you can see the flight track becomes quite a bit more erratic as they're encountering precipitation and cloud cover, descending through that cloud cover as they're approaching the airport. So here's 5 minutes before the hour. Here's right at 4 o'clock. And then they go across the airport between 4 and 4:05, and then fortunately encounter that. So here's an image of the warning level products that were out there. So you had a center weather advisory for low IFR conditions, kind of in central Texas, and a convective SIGMET in that area moving northeastward. I do not have highlighted, but is definitely there was an AirMet out for the low IFR conditions. And these little circles on there are station models just highlighting the flight category. So red being IFR, so below 3 miles and 1,000 feet. And then the purple being low IFR, so below 500 and a mile or so. And you can see quite numerous PIREPs throughout the area, highlighting those cloud cover conditions if you clicked on those as well. So here's a loop of the imagery, and as you can see, the flight track is definitely encountering the precipitation. The band is not moving northward all that quickly, and so it's just mainly heading from west to east with the precipitation. So making sure and preparing as you're flying out there where you pick your alternate. If you're flying VFR and things like that, picking an area to the north would have avoided the precipitation in this particular case. And unfortunately, here's a picture of the wreckage there as we went out on scene, and had the probable cause in this particular case was the non-instrument related pilot's decision to continue in the visual flight rules, encountered the IMC, and unfortunately had the loss of control with spatial disorientation. So I want to highlight another example of similar conditions here. So that last example had cloud cover and a little bit of precipitation. This one has a combination of factors as well. As a flight from Fort Collins area, so kind of central and northeastern Colorado, heading to Moab, Utah for a family vacation, meeting another family. The pilot had about 300 hours or so of flight time, did flight following as well. Typically would check the weather according to the flight instructor that this pilot had. But in this particular case, the pilot was running behind. He had planned to leave much earlier in the day and had to stay late at work and things like that, and unfortunately led to 4 fatalities. Here's the METAR closest to the accident site, but rifle is pretty much in a valley, and so you can see that the broken ceiling and cloud covers and things like that is much higher in the terrain, so at 7,000 feet above the airport. But there is, in the remarks section, there's lightning distant to the south, which highlights one of the hazards that they're flying through. So on this day, there was a low pressure center over the central Colorado area, is moving from west to east. And here's kind of all the different AWOS and ASOS, or official reporting station sites around the accident site, which is highlighted in the star. And the first METAR that I showed there is from rifles to the west-southwest, but actually closer to the altitude that this pilot was going, which was between 10 and 13,000 feet. There's actually a site up on top of one of the mountains around 10,500 to 11,000 feet. And you can see from there at that altitude, it was about a mile visibility, light rain, overcast 200 ceilings, and then gusty winds to 24 knots or so, and also mentioned the lightning distant there as well. So much closer to the altitude that this flight was going at, and to avoid the terrain there as well. So here's the flight track from northeast to southwest, so heading in towards Utah in the area. They travel done about 3/4 or a portion of the flight before encountering precipitation, and then you can see the altitudes and things like that definitely start to change quite a bit more. So the flight left about 7:20. They were planning to leave about 2 to 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Had flight following service there, and was going to go about 15,000 feet to get over the mountains, and then they get back down there across the terrain. Headed direct to the VOR there, and was basically between about 10,500 and 11,000 feet for the majority of the flight till about 7:30, 7:40 or so. But then the altitude starts to change quite a bit, going up to as high as about 13,000 feet and down to about 10,500. But it was very variable going across the mountainous terrain, and there are definitely some weather considerations as we move through there. One of the passengers actually sent a text message back to the mother who was on the ground there, saying they were trying to avoid the weather conditions. So here's another summary chart of this particular sequence here, showing they encountered the precipitation between about 7:50 and 7:45. So the pink dots being the flight track going to the west-southwest or so. And they're in and out of the precipitation. Unfortunately, the freezing level was around 11,000 feet or 11,500 feet on this particular case as well. But it appears that right around 8, they do break out of some precipitation, but then encounter more cloud cover as they're heading northwestbound in another patch of precipitation. And unfortunately, that's where the accident site had. So I did want to highlight, and I apologize in advance for using this graphic here, but it definitely shows quite a bit of information on one chart, and there's a lot of good resources out there, including Aviation Weather Center, AOPA have a lot of resources on upper air soundings and how that information can be extremely valuable. Basically, to summarize, that's basically releasing a balloon from the ground all the way up to wherever it pops, 40, 50, 60, 100,000 feet, and you get temperature, moisture, wind information. You can tell a lot from there where fog will form, low clouds, and things like that. And so in this particular diagram here from the accident site, we were able to model and show the red line being the temperature line, the dashed line being the moisture. When they're close together, that's where you'll see cloud cover quite a bit of the time. You can highlight the freezing level and things like that, and potential for icing. And there was actually quite a bit of wind over the terrain there as well. And anytime you get near terrain, even low-level terrain, you could have potentially encounter mountain wave conditions as well. So quite a bit of forecast for mountain obscuration. There was a convective SIGMET out because a few of the rain shower cells actually were a little bit more conducive and actually did turn into full-on thunderstorm activity. This was highlighted there across the region, and that area was moving from west to east with that low pressure center, as you saw. A few of the icing products that were out there did highlight the potential for likely icing conditions, and so an area that the pilot was likely trying to avoid there at 13 to 12,000 feet, but just so much terrain there in Colorado makes it difficult. And so here's a few pictures of the accident site in this particular case there as well. And I did want to highlight again that as you're flying through cloud cover, in this case, there was not only precipitation, but icing considerations there as well. So again, it's typically not just one different scenario as pilots are encountering these weather hazards. So we had the probable cause being the non-instrument rated pilots flight into the IMC conditions there, got spatially disoriented as well, and unfortunately lost control of the airplane. So I do want to highlight a number of things, and I'm sure the other presenters will talk on this. And a lot of times in several scenarios in accidents, especially VFR and IMC ones, we'll have pilots that will just check the weather at the departure and destination and forget that weather happens in the middle. Again, it happened taking off at sunrise and sunset, peak times where moisture can pool a little bit together. If there are light winds, you can see fog or low clouds form and things like that. Also, when are the forecasts issued? Some of the forecasts are issued every 1 hour, every 3 hours, every 6 hours, and things like that. And so knowing when the next product's going to come out might behoove you as a pilot to delay a little bit just to make sure to get the newest forecast out there. And then what's in the surrounding area. Again, making a decision of where to pick an alternate location to land if you get into some unfortunate weather issues is extremely important. I can't stress enough, just practicing doing that every time you go out and fly on clear weather days, just running through those routines, because then when you unfortunately encounter weather, that'll be built in there as well. So I know the first two scenarios I kind of highlighted and showed. You may not think, oh, well, I'm a pilot, I have way more than 300 or 200 hours of flight time, but unfortunately VFR and IMC conditions do encounter even high time pilots and cause issues, as you'll see in this example. This is an IFR flight from Central Florida up to Cairo, Georgia, which is kind of southern Georgia area. They're flying IFR. The commercially rated pilot had over 1,000 hours, and then had a passenger who had between 9,000 and 10,000 hours, was very comfortable flying at low altitudes because they were comfortable with flying actually helicopters and flying below cloud cover and that. And they received a weather briefing talking about the low ceilings and visibilities there in northern Florida and southern Georgia, and unfortunately led to the two fatalities in this case. And you can see the closest METAR here with 3 miles in mist and overcast at 400. And again, the temperature and dew point are very close together there as well. So here's kind of a brief overview of the weather across the southeastern United States right around the accident time. The flight path being from Lakeland, just in general, is following that northwestward track on the black dashed lines. You can see a frontal boundary there draped across the northeastern Gulf. The station models, the circles are not filled in south of the warm front, so indicating mostly clear, partly cloudy skies and things like that, much warmer down there. But once you go into Alabama and Georgia, South Carolina, and even Mississippi area, you can see all the circles are filled in. So extensive cloud cover across that area. The two dashed lines in pink there indicating mist, and there was fog, and there's actually some precipitation up in northeastern Georgia and South Carolina as well. So much lower cloud cover once you go north of the warm front boundary. Here's a brief outline of the flight track. As they're heading northwest bound, you can see a pretty consistent flight track up to the northwest, and then becomes quite a bit more erratic, and I'll explain that as we go through the scenario here. They got their weather briefing about 8:30 or so, talking about the Center Weather Service advisory for the low IFR conditions. There was a SIGMET for thunderstorm activity in the northeastern, but that was forecast to stay just out in the Gulf. The briefer told the pilot's pretty bad out there, and they said they'd wait about an hour or two before taking off, but they departed about 30 minutes later or so. They did report having the airport in sight about 30 miles out, but based on witness observations and what we're able to pull from satellite, that likely was not the case. But they did cancel IFR at that time, and that's where the flight track became quite a bit more erratic in altitude and in direction there. And they were able to reestablish with air traffic control, but at that point, they were never able to get the flight less erratic, and unfortunately ran into another pocket of weather as well, and I'll go into that. So there's abundant rain across, mainly stationed in the northeastern Gulf and along the west coast of Florida, and they did avoid quite a bit of the precipitation. And here's kind of a highlight scenario of all the forecast products that were out on this particular day. The darker colors indicate areas where there were Center Weather Service advisories, highlighting the low IFR, or all the pink circles there, and IFR being all the red circles. So you can see it's basically the whole southeast is at least IFR. And then air mets out for that, and a few higher air mets for icing conditions in the higher cloud cover there as well. And that stayed pretty consistent throughout the morning and throughout the accident time frame here as well. So here's another summary flight track with weather radar. You can see they avoided the precipitation as they head from Lakeland all the way up to northern Florida, and they were in contact with the TRACON over there at Tallahassee, and said they were still IMC at this particular point, about a third of the way up the flight track, and then they cancel IFR, saying they had the airport in sight. And I don't know if my mouse really shows up on this screen here, but up in the upper left-hand corner, where that's the airport that they were going to. But based on the satellite imagery we had available at the time, as well as a witness observation, the passenger they were going to pick up took this picture at the exact time they canceled IFR. This is looking south. It was raining and quite a bit of low cloud cover pointing in that direction. So it's unlikely that they did have the airport in sight based on that and what our research and engineering folks were able to calculate there as well. The flight became a little bit more erratic there. They were able to reestablish with TRACON there and head westbound, but unfortunately, that's as they were turning back east to make an approach into the airport, they encountered a building rain shower, as you can see highlighted by this this weather radar loop there as well. And unfortunately, they were relatively low to the ground, and so when that happened, things became quite a bit turbulent, and that's where it led to the loss of control here. And here's some pictures of the accident scene here. So the probable cause in this case was the loss of control due to spatial disorientation. In addition, the pilot did have multiple medications and drugs in their system as well, which potentially did lead to some degradation of decision making while in those weather conditions there. So I wanted to highlight a few more things, and I'll hand off to the next presenter, but AOP Day does a great weather survey, and it's been very helpful for us to kind of understand trends of what pilots are using. And here's kind of a highlight area over the last 5 or 6 years. And we know folks are calling flight service and LEDOS less, and you're using aviation apps more, as you can see from the left side of the screen, mainly due to the graphics and things like that. And I totally understand it. It's user friendly on the graphics and things there. It's very helpful. But one of the things I do want to stress, and this is the initial weather briefing, and then immediately prior to flight, folks are getting on their XM weather or FSB weather and things like that, is make sure as you're doing your weather briefing that you do talk to a weather briefer, or if you're not able to do that, talk to somebody who's experienced in the potential weather conditions that you're going to fly in, and bounce your weather ideas off of them. We know folks are using aviation apps and things, but making sure that you're at least selecting something on your app that a forecaster has touched or a human being has touched is extremely important. Don't just use weather apps and things out there that are just weather computer model data. And I know the folks that will present today can definitely highlight areas where that could be. But things like AirMets and center weather advisories are folks that are touched by human beings that are going out there and using their expertise and highlighting where pilots should be more concerned about the weather there. And so please, as you're briefing yourself on your weather conditions and things like that, make sure that you're at least looking at one weather forecast product that a human being has touched, and not just all the fancier looking computer model data, because that may lead you down a wrong path, unfortunately. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight things about ForeFlight and other apps. A lot of them, do step through the standard weather information, which is some great tools in there, and a lot of those will have AirMets and those conditions in there. But some of the resources I'm not just picking on ForeFlight, but there's quite a few other out there, just use weather computer model data, and so knowing which ones are those and the pitfalls of those can definitely be highlighted here today on the call, or also talking to somebody who's experienced using those weather apps. So please make sure you talk to that. And definitely saw this. This was a study that was done by NASA, and I know it's a lot of numbers and a lot of percent signs and tables and things like that, and it's getting to the evening, and folks don't want to put too much math on everybody, but there's a very helpful study. It talked about VFR local flights, VFR cross country there in the middle, and IFR and wet weather products. A lot of pilots were checking. You can see radar, TAFs, and METARs. Folks are checking that all the time. regardless if they're doing VFR local to IFR. You add winds aloft when you go to cross country and IFR for fuel planning and things like that. But there's a lot of weather products out there. Unfortunately, quite a few pilots are not checking, which do have the human interaction touch and things like that, like air mets and sig mets. You can see folks are checking those only maybe half the time or so. And so building, as you're building through your routine and doing just a VFR local flight, and it's a beautiful VFR day, just practicing those scenarios where, you know, if I get into weather, this would be my alternate and things like that is extremely important, because you'll build that repetition and things that can keep you safe in further products. And my last slide here, I just want to highlight again a reason to talk to, you know, folks out there and not just rely on weather computer model data. So as a pilot, you could be looking and see an air met for mountain obscuration. This was a condition back in 2018 when there was abundant wildfire smoke out there. And so just looking through that scenario, you see sky clear, it's going to be a beautiful day and things like that. Why in the world do they have an air mat out there? And then you can click on that, and that's something that may or may not be highlighted by a weather computer model, but a human being forecaster looking at PyReps and all the other information can highlight an area for, you know, potential issues with slantwise visibility and things like that. And so with that, here's my email. You can email me or type questions into the chat, and happy and looking forward to the rest of the presentations. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'm going to leave your slide there up for a few more seconds to give people ample time to copy down your information there. I appreciate your presentation. Those are sobering and helpful reminders of what can and will happen in a given winter weather season. And it goes without saying, these conditions, VFR and IFR, will form at some point on a given day as we head into the cold season. So that's why we're providing the education that we are, and helping you to know where to look for conditions such as these, and maybe delay your flight, maybe reschedule, maybe pick an alternate airfield, whatever helps you stay safe. So appreciate your time, Paul. We'll turn it over to Mark Boguski here. Just two quick reminders. Feel free to submit your questions as we go. We'll be able to answer some of those via the chat. We'll also have a little bit of time at the end to field any that are unaddressed. Also, this entire presentation is going to be available on YouTube probably tomorrow, starting tomorrow. So if you don't feel like, you know, copying down certain slides, those will be available to you at any given point on YouTube very soon. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark, who has some more helpful information to us. And Mark, the presentation is yours, sir.
All right, very good, thank you. Let's see here.
All right, we've got you loud and clear, and we see your presentation there.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Okay, so that was some really good information. And you hear me okay?
Hey, firm, we've got you loud and clear.
Okay, good, thank you. So good evening, and thanks for joining us. My name is Mark Boguski, and I'm a CFI in Olathe, Kansas, and a FAST team representative. And I've been asked to give a pilot's perspective on VFR flight into IMC. You know, as we've seen from Paul's presentation, flight into IMC is one of the most serious situations a GA pilot can face if they're not trained and prepared. And because pilots of all levels can get themselves into trouble. I wanted to start with a short video that dramatizes the seriousness of VFR into IMC flight. AOPA Air Safety Institute put together this video, and frankly, it's terrifying. But it's a powerful reminder of why we need to avoid flight into IMC unless we're trained and prepared. Let's see here. Just the video is not showing?
It's still loading. We'll give it another few seconds here.
Okay. I don't think that video is going at all, did you?
Yeah, for the sake of time, I guess let's proceed. That was a great video. It's too bad we can't see it, but maybe we can try again later. But yeah, for now, let's proceed with the presentation.
Okay, very good. Well, if you get a chance, go on to NWS Air Safety Institute website, and you can see the video 178 Seconds to Live. So naturally, the best avoidance technique is to avoid IMC altogether. And unless you're trained on an instrument flight plan, flight in the clouds can be perfectly safe if you're prepared for it and if you're following the proper procedures. It's when we push ourselves and our aircraft beyond our capabilities that we get into trouble. What I'd like to talk about tonight is why do pilots fly into IMC? We'll talk about go, no-go decision making, and we'll talk about some personal minimums. And if you do find yourself in IMC or some kind of low visibility situation, what do we do to get out of IMC? How do we fly with reference to instruments? And then also, how do we get ATC assistance? Let's do a quick review, though, of the definition of IFR and VFR. In controlled airspace, IFR conditions are defined as being less than 3 miles visibility and or 1,000-foot ceilings. And we further designate low IFR conditions as being a mile visibility and or 500-foot ceilings. VFR is designated as greater than 3 statute miles or 1,000-foot ceilings, but that is also designated as marginal VFR. We don't get what we call more safe VFR until we're 5 statute miles visibility and 3,000-foot ceilings. We're going to try something. I've never tried this before, but we're going to do a quick poll here. And let's see have you experienced flying in IMC? And so, yes, I'm instrument rated. Yes, I'm not instrument rated, or no. We'll give it just a couple more seconds. We've got about 75% of people voted. All right, well, we've got 85% of people watching have voted, and 44% are IFR certified and they have experience IMC flight. 15% have said yes, but they're not IFR certified, and 41% no, they have not experienced VFR into IMC. That's interesting. When we're new students, we learn how to gather weather reports and forecasts. And we also, when we fly solo, we fly under strict limitations set by our CFI. They tell us what kind of visibility, clouds, winds, etc., that we are able to fly under. Depending on when you learn to fly, there are a host of new tools and resources that have become available to pilots that just weren't available even a few years ago, and they're constantly improving. In fact, I'd say that with new tools like the graphical forecast for aviation and some of the other weather products available from the National Weather Service, as well as products from Flight Service and the EFB products that are available, not even to mention some of the smart apps that are on smartphones, we've never had a more complete weather information available to us. And as Paul mentioned, it's highly a good idea to use a weather briefer, if at all, when the weather's at all questionable. And we don't have time to discuss all of these various products, but the National Weather Service presentation will follow. We'll show some of those products. One thing is, it's really incumbent upon all of us as pilots to continually grow in our meteorological knowledge so that we become safer pilots. In addition to weather training, we've also received training on how to fly in marginal weather conditions by flying under the hood. However, oftentimes we didn't get a chance to fly in the clouds or with marginal weather conditions. Now, I always try to take my students up in the clouds or in poor visibility conditions, but it's not always possible. Sometimes the weather's just too good. Now, the FAA mandates a minimum of 3 hours of simulated instrument training or flying by reference to instruments for private pilots. And as we all know, if we don't constantly practice these skills, they'll erode quickly. That's why instrument pilots are required to shoot a minimum number of approaches every 6 months, in addition to practicing other skills. If you can, it'd be great to offer yourself up as a safety pilot for an instrument pilot, and you'll get some good experience in instrument operations and procedures. Once we get our license, however, we're on our own, and it's up to us to be making our own weather decisions. Now, I always encourage my former students to call me if they've got any questions about weather or various go, no-go decisions. You know, weather's a very dynamic situation, and our decision-making also needs to be equally dynamic. It's always a little frustrating when you get out, it's a beautiful day, but by the time you get down to the airport and pull the plane out of the hangar and unforecasted clouds move in. Or we find ourselves on a cross country and the clouds were forecast to have been lifted, but they're still persisting there. It's a beautiful day everywhere except for our intended destination, and we have to divert. Or you've been sitting on the ground for the last hour waiting for a front to pass and watching a radar feed on ForeFlight. And finally, the radar indicates there's an opening. But is there, and will it stay open? You know, visibility is still poor, but it's called marginal VFR right now. And this is what the view looked like once the pilot took off. While technically VFR, the flight conditions were still marginal and needed to be watched carefully. Here's another case that a pilot ran into. This is what it's like to be trapped between layers. He sent me this picture while he was out flying, and I told him, get the heck out of there. He turned around and told me later that within 3 minutes, the clouds had closed in behind him. You know, any of these situations could lend themselves to a VFR to IMC incident. Let's try one more poll here. Why do we as pilots get ourselves into tight weather situations? Is it a lack of weather knowledge, a lack of experience, or a matter of temperament? Think about your own experience in weather-related situations, and let's hear what you think. All right, we've got about 75% people voted. We'll just open it, keep it open for a couple more seconds here. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll. And that's pretty fascinating. Roughly a third or so, but 28% consider it lack of weather knowledge, 34% lack of real world experience, and 38% saying, you know, the temperament or our attitude towards flying into IMC. So thanks for that. Thanks for your input there. And so why do pilots fly into IMC? Well, the reality is that pilots get themselves into trouble for a variety of reasons depending upon their level of experience. And we've seen evidence of very experienced pilots getting into VFR into IMC accidents. You know, most recently, think of like the Kobe Bryant helicopter crash, where they had a very experienced pilot. We've also seen notable cases where a non-instrument rated pilot gets into a low visibility situation with disastrous results. I always think of the JFK Jr. accident off of Martha's Vineyard. You know, there are many more examples, some that Paul just showed us, but I mention these because they're both widely known. In both these cases, the pilots knew they were going from VFR conditions into a low visibility environment. They had the opportunity to turn around, but they made the decision to press forward. We as pilots in command need to constantly evaluate our own attitudes and psychological factors affecting us for continuing a flight when things are going into poor weather. You know, there are numerous case studies available on the AOPA Air Safety Institute website, and I'd encourage you to watch some of these and give some thoughts to how these accidents can be prevented. Now, let's talk about go, no-go decisions now. As we said from the beginning, the best way to avoid these accidents is to avoid IMC. And so how do we go about that? You know, the process for evaluating weather should start days before we actually make a flight. You look at the trends, look at the big picture, and start big on a national or regional scale, depending on how far you're flying. And ask yourself, you know, is there any hazardous or challenging weather along the route? What weather is expected at my ETA? And what direction would I go if I were to get into IMC, and how would I find good VFR conditions? And could I leave sooner or delay my departure? Or could I go part way, land, and wait until the weather improves? Go ahead and get the big picture. You know, we talked about all the different resources that are available now, but some of the best times it's good just to look local weather or the Weather Channel, something like that, and get an overall picture of what's going on. Aviationweather.gov can't speak highly enough about the graphical forecast for aviation tool, but that's just a fantastic tool for going through and getting an overview and probing down into what the weather is. If you decide to go, then it's time to get a more detailed briefing. And I still use flight service weather briefers a lot. I like talking to a real person. You can also self-brief using the flight service website or one of the EFBs that record the fact that you've gotten a briefing. And in that briefing, you're going to get TFRs, airmets, SIGMETs. You'll get the weather across the route. Be able to look at radar, cloud bases, winds aloft, speed and direction of frontal movement. And so all of those are important things that go into that. If based on all that, you decide it's a go, so what's the next step? While we're en route, make sure you're constantly checking the weather. You can talk to flight service on 122.2 generally, or on a nearby VOR frequency. We've got ADSB, and you can check AWOSs, ASOSs, and ATIS along the route of flight. Based on that information, do you continue or do you divert? And the main thing is make sure you always have an out. And if you've got passengers with you, make your passengers part of the decision-making process. There's a video that Rob Machado put together on VFR to IMC. And I love the way Rob Machado takes an introspective look into the psychology of pilots. Rob makes an excellent point that there are generally two reasons why pilots press on into bad weather. First, pilots are very goal-oriented, and once we begin a task, we generally do whatever it takes to complete it, particularly if there are negative consequences for not completing it, such as spending an unplanned night at a deserted airport or missing that football game that we were flying to. And I would venture that most of the time when we launch on across country, there's probably a pressing reason in our mind that we really should complete that trip. This is the classic case of get-there-itis. And secondly, if we have passengers who want to get to a destination or people waiting for us at the destination, we don't want to disappoint them. And this is a great strategy that Rod suggests. Make your passengers part of the decision-making process. Before you depart, ask them if there's any reason that any one of them would be unwilling to divert, turn around, or cancel the flight. Well, generally, they're all going to say, oh no, we want to be safe. Because we all know that it's much easier to cancel before we leave if the weather's looking bad than if we're halfway there and we have to make a decision to divert. The classic case of external pressures that we all know from the PAVE checklist, right? By asking your passengers that question up front, now you've made them invested in the decision to fly safely. One of the things we all have to remember is that weather forecasts are just that. They're forecasts. And while our ability to forecast weather has improved dramatically over the last few years, they're still forecasts. And as I said earlier, weather is dynamic and your decision making needs to be equally dynamic. So I want to take a quick look at a weather scenario, give you a chance to make a go or no-go decision. Let's look at making a VFR flight from Olathe New Century Airport to Branson, Missouri, to enjoy some Christmas festivities with the kids. We're going to be departing today at 4 p.m. and the flight should take us about 1 hour and 37 minutes. Here's our route of flight, and the weather symbols are a little hard to see in this view. This is from the graphical forecast for aviation. So if I click on the various airports, I can bring up the textual TAFs. This might be a little bit easier for you to see. So I'm going to give you just a second to look at those TAFs. And give you a chance to do another poll. So I also put up the prog chart here to give you another view. So let's open up the poll. And what would your decision be? Go or no go, given the weather that you see there? I think we're being pretty consistent here so far throughout the poll. We've got about 70% of people voted. Just a couple more seconds. All right, why don't we go ahead and close the poll down. And that's pretty comforting. 82% of the people thought that's a no-go situation. There's always one other option that we didn't put up here, though, but is, do you need more information? You know, given look at the TAFs and looking at the prog chart, I thought it was pretty clear that the weather looked pretty dreadful there for that flight going in this evening. I want to talk a minute about some of the tools that we have, and one of them is the personal minimums worksheet. And this is available on FAA, I think safety.gov. But I like this tool because it focuses on what skills you have available through your training, your experience, and your currency and proficiency, and then what skills are needed for a specific flight. And so this worksheet allows you to go through, evaluate where you are in your flying career, and it's a good idea to talk it over with your CFI and then make decisions on when and when you won't fly. And the real question is, okay, once you fill this out, how hard will you stick to it? And that's something that I always advise, talk with your spouse or your CFI and say, okay, here's my copy of my personal minimums worksheet, and this is when I'm not going to fly. It gives you a chance to have someone else kind of back you up on that decision. If we do find ourselves in the soup, what are the steps we need to take? Well, first of all, you need to expect a very high stress level. And the situation probably didn't happen suddenly, though it can, but more than likely you've been flying along through diminishing visibility or lowering ceilings and starting to get agitated and concerned, if not downright panicked. The key is to maintain situational awareness and control the airplane. Recognize and accept the situation for what it is. It's an emergency. Maintain control of the plane and trust your instruments. And especially if you're not current on instruments, as soon as you can maintain level flight, contact ATC, declare an emergency, and request assistance. Now, if you know the frequencies for ATC in your particular area, you can contact them directly. And if you're not sure, you can contact them on 121.5 and squawk 7700 on your transponder. And ATC can help by alerting you if you're not flying or heading or maintaining altitude, and can give you vectors to VFR conditions. Now remember, ATC can't see clouds on their radar, but they can only see precipitation. But they can look at METARs and have other information from other flights and suggest areas that are in VFR conditions. maintaining control of our planes, you need to trust your instruments. And so make sure the airplane is trimmed for level flight and your power is set for normal cruise power settings. You know, as part of your primary training, you've had a minimum of 3 hours of flight by reference to instruments, and hopefully more than that after you, got your certificate. And while that training was not intended to make you proficient in instrument flight, it was intended to help you maintain control of the airplane by flying with your instruments. If you haven't flown under the hood recently, these skills will quickly erode, and it's a good idea to go practice them often with a safety pilot or a CFI. The primary instrument that you'll need to rely on is your attitude indicator. Trim the plane for fingertip control. Avoid having a death grip on the yoke. It's very hard to maintain small movements if you've got a death grip. And don't over control the plane. Any attitude changes must be small and smooth. If you've got an autopilot or a wing leveler, turn that on and use that to help you maintain straight and level flight. The 4 basic maneuvers in an airplane are straight and level, turns, climbs, and descents. I'd suggest practicing these 4 basic maneuvers under the hood with your CFI if you haven't done them lately. If you were to get into IMC, after establishing control of the airplane, you'll be using these maneuvers to get yourself out of the clouds, and hopefully with the assistance of ATC. If possible, a 180-degree turn may be all that's needed to get you back into VFR conditions, but you'll have to evaluate your particular situation. It may be that a climb or descent will be the right course of action. And ATC can be a great assistance to help you, once you've got the plane stabilized. Make sure you use every tool that you've got to help yourself get yourself back into visual conditions. Well, we've talked about why pilots get themselves into trouble and a little bit about how to get yourself out. And I'd like to direct you to some resources that could be really helpful. One is AOPA.org. The Air Safety Institute has some very good training videos on VFR flight into IMC. Another resource we've got is FAAsafety.gov and the WINGS program. They've got a lot of resources and a lot of seminars there. There's numerous commercial sites for training and for advice, and so avail yourself of those. And most importantly, get with your CFI and go out there and get proficient. That's the main thing to help you become a safer and more competent pilot. And with that, turn it back over, and thank you very much for listening.
All right, well, thank you, Mark. It was a great presentation. Appreciate your time tonight. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to submit those on the dashboard there. We've already got some great questions, and we'll continue to field those as we go. So we'll now transition to kind of the nuts and bolts of IFR conditions from a weather standpoint. We've got 3 presenters from the NWS FLYERS team who'll be going through some various topics tonight, and then we'll wrap it up and should be able to finish up within the next hour or so, 30 minutes to an hour. So we'll start it off with Jeremiah. He's a meteorologist at AWC, and he's going to be talking about some temperature and dew point basics. Let me give you control very quickly here, Jeremiah. All right, it is yours.
All right, thank you. So my name is Jeremiah Pyle, and I'm a forecaster with the Aviation Weather Center. I've been here for about 2 years now, and I have past experience for about 10 years working in local forecast offices in Portland, Oregon, and Boston, Massachusetts. So I've got a lot of different aviation forecasting experience at this point, both at the local level and nationally. And so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about a few of the important definitions that we need to know in order to understand fog and low stratus formation. But before I go into that, let's first just define fog what is fog? I mean, I think everyone has a pretty intuitive sense, but basically it's just a cloud at the ground surface. So a cloud of tiny water droplets suspended in the atmosphere near the ground surface. And depending on what part of the country you live in, fog is going to be more or less of a concern for aviation. So, for instance, where I came from, up in the Pacific Northwest, fog is a very frequent occurrence and often very dense fog. And up in the Northeast and the Appalachians too, you see a lot of dense fog. But on the flip side, in this desert Southwest and Intermountain West, you'll very rarely see dense fog conditions. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is here in a few slides. So we defined fog. What is stratus? And it's basically the same thing. So both of them are low clouds. A stratus cloud is a low uniform sheet-like cloud located between the ground level and 6,500 feet. And so fog is basically just a stratus cloud that has reached the ground. So I used to teach a lot of spotter training classes in my past job, and I kind of equate this to the difference between funnel clouds and tornadoes. It's kind of the same phenomenon. A funnel cloud is in the air, and then when it reaches the ground, it becomes a tornado. So it's kind of the same deal here. Stratus cloud, once it reaches the ground, becomes fog. And so before we go and answer our question in detail, let's just kind of give a foreshadowing for where we're headed here. And ask the question, what causes fog and stratus to form? And when you boil it down to its most basic, it's actually pretty simple. You get fog when atmospheric processes result in one of the following two things happening. You either cool the air to its dew point, or you raise the dew point to the air temperature. So you cool the air or you add moisture to the air. That's really as simple as it gets. So let's define a few important parameters that we need to know to understand how the fog and stratus is forming. So the simplest one, temperature, I think probably everyone here has a pretty good intuitive sense for what that means. So it's basically how warm is the air, right? A measure of the warmth of the ambient air. And the low level temperature is going to be determined by the relative magnitudes of several different transfers of heat energy. So pretty much all of the heat that we have in our low level atmosphere is originating from the sun. So the sun's heating the ground through radiation, and then as the ground warms up, it's warming that low level air through conduction. And then as the low level air warms up, it rises through convection. So, warm air rises, cold air sinks, right? And so we've got all of these different kind of counteracting transfers of heat energy. And so the relative balance of these is going to determine what the surface temperature is. So let's think about what happens at night. So all of a sudden, the incoming radiation part of that heat balance disappears. And so we're no longer absorbing sunlight, but we're continuing to emit heat out into the atmosphere through long-wave radiation. And so that's why at night our surface temperatures cool, because we now have much more outgoing heat than we have incoming. And as the ground surface cools, the air cools through conduction again. So one thing that we have to factor into all of this is, how does cloud cover impact the amount of incoming and outgoing radiation? And so it's really important for both daytime and nighttime. If we have a lot of clouds during the day, they're going to block a lot of that incoming solar radiation, and so prevent the surface from warming up as much as it otherwise might. But on the flip side, if we have cloud cover at night, that can actually act as sort of a blanket and kind of trap some of that outgoing long-wave radiation and keep it near the surface. And so that's why you'll often see, if we have a lot of low cloud cover, overnight low temperatures are much warmer than they would be on a clear night. And that's because on the clear night, all of that radiation can easily escape out into the atmosphere. Okay, so that's temperature. Now let's look at the other important term here, which is dew point. So the meteorological definition of dew point is the temperature to which air must be cooled in order for saturation to occur. So at its simplest, it's basically just a measure of atmospheric moisture. And so the higher the dew point is, the greater the amount of water vapor in the air. And like we saw with this graphic I showed a couple of slides ago showing the prevalence of fog, you'll see that there are big differences in dew point temperatures as you go across the country. So a lot of that area that we looked at before in the Southwest and Intermountain West that rarely sees dense fog, typically will have some of the lowest dew points in the country. And so those are very much related. If you don't have much moisture in the atmosphere, you're not going to have much potential for fog. So let's look at dew point and kind of how does it vary through the day. We call this the diurnal trend of dew point. So during the daytime, we'll often see wind develop and convection start to occur as the surface warms, and we start to get that atmospheric mixing. And a lot of times you'll see that the dew point will slowly start to lower as that mixing increases, because we're starting to pull down drier air from aloft. And then at night, when the wind diminishes and we start to see less convective mixing, that all of a sudden allows some of that low-level moisture that we can get from wet soils from previous rainfall or nearby bodies of water, or even a lot of plants that emit moisture as well. Once we decrease that mixing at night, that low-level moisture can start to pool, and we'll see dew points start to creep up again. So I took a screen capture here of a station in Sacramento, California last week. They were actually in a really good fog pattern out in the Central Valley of California last week. And so I just wanted to show a graph of temperature and dew point just to kind of illustrate these diurnal trends. So you see temperature obviously tends to increase during the day and then drop off at night. What I really want to point out here is that the times where we're starting to think about fog in low stratus are these times where the temperature drops down to near the dew point. And so we're going to talk about why that is here in the next couple of slides. But I just wanted to illustrate, what a typical diurnal trend looks like for a good fog pattern here. So let's talk about a couple of other terms related to low-level moisture that you'll frequently hear. So one of them that is very commonly used is relative humidity. And basically what that means is it's the percentage of the total amount of moisture present relative to the amount that the air could possibly hold at that temperature. And so looking at that same chart for Sacramento that I had on the previous slide, but adding in relative humidity here in green, you can see that in areas where the temperature and the dew point are basically the same, that brings our relative humidity up to 100%. So the air is holding as much water vapor as it possibly can at that temperature. And then during the day, when you see that temperature rise and you've got a difference between your temperature and your dew point, then theoretically you could add more moisture to that air. It could hold more. And so the relative humidity drops. And so here you can see for this particular peak, we've got a relative humidity down around 70%. Another term that is often used is dew point depression, and it's very much related to the other terms we've already discussed. So it's the difference between the temperature and the dew point temperature. So basically you take temperature and you subtract your dew point, and that's your dew point depression. So in these areas where they're pretty much on top of each other, your dew point depression is going to be 0. Okay, so now let's talk about how do these different terms that we've defined interact to create fog and low clouds. And one example that illustrates it really well, that pretty much everyone gets in their intro to meteorology class, is the example of pulling a frosty cold beverage out of your refrigerator. So everyone knows that when you do that, you get water droplets forming on it, right? And that is basically the same process that's happening when fog forms. So you take the cold can out, and it's much colder than the ambient room temperature air. And so the air that's directly adjacent to the can starts to cool down rapidly. And if there's enough moisture in the air, the temperature around the can cools to the dew point and can no longer hold all of the water vapor. And so it starts to condense and change from a gas to a liquid. And so that's basically the same thing that's happening when fog forms. So we've got an animation here, the one on the left showing temperature decreasing towards the dew point, and the one on the right is showing dew point increasing towards the temperature. And you can see for both of them, when there's a significant difference between temperature and dew point, there's no visibility restriction. But as they get closer and closer together, you see visibility starts to become impacted as water vapor starts to condense into liquid water droplets. And so this typically happens when the difference between the air temperature and the dew point gets down to 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, is when you'll start to see that happen. Okay, so we basically said at the very beginning of this presentation that in order to create fog, we need to either cool the temperature or increase the moisture content. So let's talk about a few different mechanisms that we can that can happen. And so on this first slide here, we have a few different ways that we can cool the temperature. So radiational cooling, we've already touched on, is when the surface is emitting radiation into the atmosphere, and so we cool the surface air mass as that heat is transferred out. And so if we cool the surface temperatures enough to the dew point, then we can get fog that way. Another mechanism is advection of warm air over cool water. So this is something that you'll see pretty frequently in the spring. Particularly, you'll notice it over the Great Lakes, where the cold water, the water is still really cold from the winter, but we start to get some of those warmer spring air masses coming in. So as that warm air moves over the cold water, the water cools the air directly adjacent to it, and you can get fog that way. And then precipitation also will cool the air mass. So if you have a subsaturated layer near the surface, as that liquid water falls through it, some of it is going to evaporate, and evaporation is a cooling process. So as that precipitation evaporates, you'll start to cool the air mass. Okay, so now let's look at ways that we can add moisture to the atmosphere. So a sea breeze or an onshore flow, like moist maritime air blowing off the Pacific onto the west coast, you'll see dew points increase significantly when that onshore flow kicks in. Or inland, if you've got some kind of a moisture source like a lake, or even a lot of plant life, will provide water vapor down in the low levels. And solar radiation will also evaporate some of that liquid moisture and create water vapor. And so that can be advected downstream and increase the moisture content in the low levels. And then you'll see that precipitation we have again on this slide. So precipitation not only cools the air mass, but also adds moisture, obviously. And so that's why it's often a very effective fog generator, because you're not only cooling, but also moistening the atmosphere at the same time. So you'll see, a lot of different names for fog out there, and I put some of the most common ones here on this slide. So there's a lot of different names for fog, but it pretty much all boils down to situations where the air is either cooled or moisture is added to the air. So advection fog we've already covered, where more moist air is advected over cool water. There's something called steam fog, which is basically the opposite of the advection fog slide here, where cool air is advected over warm water. And so some of that moisture and warmth from the water is going to mix up into that cold air mass, and you can get some shallow fog that way. Upslope fog is where moist air travels up and over terrain, and air, as it increases in altitude, cools in temperature due to the decrease in pressure. And so you can generate fog and stratus along terrain through that mechanism. Radiation fog, we've already covered radiation a couple of times, but again, as heat from the low level atmosphere is radiated out, you cool the surface temperature, and you can generate fog that way. And then precipitation, again, not only cools the air mass, but also moistens it. So you can really get fog quickly with precipitation. Okay, so this is my last slide here. To this point, we've talked about what causes fog in low stratus to form. So now let's just briefly talk about what will lead to dissipation of fog in low clouds. And not surprisingly, it's pretty much the exact opposite of what causes the clouds and fog. So to dissipate the fog, we either need to increase the temperature or decrease the dew point. And so frequently the way that this happens is that as overnight you'll see fog develop, and then as the next day, as winds begin to pick up the next day, you'll see that it starts to mix drier, warmer air above the fog layer down into the layer, and so you'll have the fog or stratus layer start to become shallower. And at the same time, down at the surface, you'll have increasing convection and also mixing from the wind occurring. So you'll actually lift the fog layer. And so it's basically lifting and becoming shallower until it eventually burns off. And the dissipation rate is dependent on a couple of factors. The depth of the fog or stratus layer, so the deeper it is, the longer it's going to take to burn off. And also the strength of the wind. So if you have really strong winds, you've got a lot of mixing, and so that'll tend to dissipate the clouds really quickly as well. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Bill to talk about favorable fog patterns.
All right, thanks, Jeremiah, and appreciate your time tonight. And those setups for fog, we can usually see the whites of its eyes come in well ahead of the initial development. So it can certainly happen on a small scale. It's kind of unexpected, but usually with those reasonable setups, a forecast will be out and available to you to keep you informed of changing conditions. So we're going to turn it over to Bill here. Let me get my setup adjusted here, and he's going to continue the discussion on fog. And Bill, the controls are yours, sir.
I am in control. Do not change your vertical, do not change your horizontal, for those of you who are old enough to remember that. Bill Cottrill, I'm a meteorologist at the AWC. I've been here for about 4.5 years. Prior to that, 11 years at Key West WFO in a much more tropical environment. Can't say I don't miss it. And also I was at Florida State University for about 10 years as an instructor in the Department of Meteorology. And we're going to kind of add to Jeremiah's presentation, fog and low clouds, but we're going to take it maybe a little bit more layperson type description. So with the changing temperatures, basically, even on a daily basis, the changing temperatures do change the amount of the dew point depression. So in other words, Jeremiah explained that the dew point depression is the difference between the temperature and the actual dew point. And the closer those two are together, the more likely we'll have either stratus or fog developing. So during the day in a typical environment, the temperature is warm because the ground heats up, and then so with that, the dew point actually mixes out, and we have a higher dew point depression. So in other words, instead of 2 to 4 degrees difference between the temperature and the dew point, it could be up to 10 to 20 degrees difference, and it would take an awful lot of moisture to add to that environment to get us to stratus or fog. At nighttime, temperatures will cool, dew points will sometimes increase, but the temperature will cool closer to the dew point temperature, which reduces the amount of the dew point depression. So in other words, the temperature and the dew point come closer together. We can also get seasonal changes, and then we're in one of those seasons where we will see more stratus and fog because we don't get as much heating during the day. So we're looking at the temperatures not increasing, so the dew point depression is pretty much a static environment through the day. The great thing that can happen is we can get cloud cover. I have to use the right mouse here. And cloud cover will actually help reduce the potential for fog, but that cloud cover is usually the stratus we have to worry about as well. So the antecedent conditions, snow cover can actually help produce low-level moisture, and then warm air overrunning that snowfall. Post-frontal or a warm front comes back over after we get a cold front with a lot of snow, and we can get intense, long-lasting fog and stratus. And rainfall also adds low-level moisture and increases dew point temperatures. So we don't necessarily need the cooler temperature, we just need to add more moisture, and that's what the rainfall can do. As for a warm front, that's warm air overrunning colder air at the surface. This happens a lot along the Gulf Coast. Fog and stratus from the cold wedge underneath the warm frontal boundary, and there could be some precipitation along that front, and then we get IFR or going into IMC conditions. Also, that warm front can also produce some advection fog, where we get fog over the water and not on land as well. So we have to watch out for that, especially when we're doing helicopter forecasts for the oil rigs. And then cold season, cool front, cold front. It's shallow cold air and overrun by warm moist air. So the cold air wedges underneath the warm moist air and pushes it up. That warm moist air starts to cool, and clouds and precipitation also start to form. And we get stratus, especially over the dome of cold air, and then maybe fog right along the boundary between the cold and the warm air. And this isn't necessarily long lasting, but it can be detrimental because it will not be static, it will be moving. The overrunning air has colder with the underlying air. The warm fronts and the cold air aloft are the warm air aloft with overrunning the cold air underneath, pardon me. That can give us fog and stratus. It doesn't need to have to be any precipitation or anything. It's just we've got the cold air, especially this time of the year, along even into the Great Lakes area, all the way up through the Central Plains and the Midwest. We can get fog, a large area of fog and stratus that develop across the entire area, especially with flow around a high pressure system ahead of a warm cold front that may be moving in from the Central Plains. And then the return flow, as I was just talking about, we depend on the strength of the subtropical ridge or the high pressure, and the axis of the warm air can affect very far inland. And then if it gets hung up along a boundary that may be across the central United States from, say, Texas all the way across Virginia, that presents a bigger problem, especially when you start to get into the Appalachians. And then you run into IMC along with terrain, and then that is a very bad situation. The fog and stratus will form overnight when the surface temperatures cool even more than along just with the boundary. So what other conditions can affect the stratus formation? So Wind generates turbulent mixing and warmer temperatures. Calm or light winds at the surface at night maximize radiational cooling, as Jeremiah was talking about. And I gotta use the right mouse again. And you can see how even if you have fog at the surface, if you have some good radiational cooling aloft, you can still get a nice stratus deck that forms above the fog, just because of the mixing of the air aloft. Now the cloud cover will reduce the radiational cooling, but the cloud tops or the clouds do cause fog top cooling unless radiation is able to escape. And the droplet formation shows and contributes to dissipation. So the bigger the droplets get, the more likely they are to fall out of the atmosphere. So new droplets collide with other older droplets, and you can get more dissipation out of fog and out of the stratus as well. Well, let's see. There we go. So high pressure, you get calm winds, clear skies, and that is, like Jeremiah said, and our presenters before said, in clear skies, you get radiational cooling. That lowers the temperature closer to the dew point. The dew point depression shrinks, and we get fog and stratus, and it can form in that environment. There are other ways that fog and stratus can form as well. Low pressure, obviously, when the low is becoming very mature, we get what we call an occluded front. It's the low is filling, and you get this triple point. You get a warm front along with the cold front, and then the fog and stratus will develop north of the warm front due to light winds and evaporative cooling or the radiational cooling. And then intensifying lows do not produce the log and the fog and the stratus as well, because usually there's a good amount of wind and mixing with a intensifying low. So some other conditions that we'll see fog, local effects, and these photos are courtesy of Michael Billings. He's taken pictures of the Missouri River. You can see the advection fog where the wind is coming across the river and picking up the moisture off the river. And so the water temperature was around 62 degrees Fahrenheit. But the low temperature with that air moving across the river was 34 degrees. So the colder air running over warmer water, it reached the dew point very quickly, and then the stratus and the fog developed. And you can see how it moved across from the one bank to the other. I could go back. I'm not quite sure how to do that. Anyhow, we will just ignore that. There we go. Thank you. So you can see how on that observation, that METAR, it was quite low visibility, quarter-mile visibility, or a quarter-mile fog, and vertical visibility of less than 100 feet. So it was pretty challenging if there was an airport right there, which obviously there was. The other things you can do with this advection fog, I worked a project in 2005 in Costa Rica. We were stationed mainly at the Juan Santa Maria Airport in San Juan, Costa Rica. It lies in a horseshoe canyon. We, for about 3 months before we went to do this project, which was in July, which they call their wet season, we were practicing on riding TAFs for a couple of the NOAA hurricane hunters and an ER-2 aircraft, which is basically a U-2 aircraft. It has to fly VFR. There are no instruments on this aircraft. even though they fly way above where anybody else would fly. But we thought we had it under control. We were looking at TAFs out of Costa Rica that were calling for CAV OK during the afternoons. And in the afternoons, that just was not the case. In the Horseshoe Canyon, the western edge of that canyon was open to the Pacific Ocean. And every day as San Juan heated up, the air lifted out of the Horseshoe Canyon and was filled in by the marine layer coming in off the Pacific. And there were days where we saw 200-foot ceilings and aircraft coming down so hard to where some of the flight crews were running for cover. So it was quite scary. Also, the fog formation, this is a very popular time for folks to fly from this area of the country to South Florida. And this is a great time for fog in South Florida, especially in the Miami and the Keys and south of Tampa especially. There's a lot of low-level moisture there. The Everglades are there, and the water is not very deep, so it responds to cold fronts very quickly. And then the warmer air comes back in very quickly, and the water takes a little longer to heat up. And so they get fog there quite a bit. I have actually seen fog of 1/4 mile visibility in Key West, which is a huge anomaly. Probably 2% of the time Key West has MVFR, and less than 1% of the time it has IFR. And this was definitely low IFR and probably not useful to fly in. Even the airlines would not fly in that. So other conditions that affect stratus formation in addition to temperature. Local effects, the terrain, as I talked about in San Juan, the surface flux, saturated soil or water like the Everglades, vegetation. We have this thing called evapotranspiration, which is basically plant life giving off water. And then bodies of water, lakes, we get lake effect, we can get lake effect fog, as well as snow across the Great Lakes. What should pilots be aware of? You need to know the forecast. Look at your TAFs, not only at your departure, but at your destination. Get your also get your briefings. Aviation Weather Center or aviationweather.gov. It's a great resource for graphical forecasts as well as the observations, the TAFs, and SIGMETs, AirMets. We have a one-stop shop. And then as you're going on your flight, make sure you're referencing those as you go. Do not just sit back on what you get on your initial information. Make sure that you're keeping up on it because conditions can change very quickly. Thanks very much. I hope I haven't confused you all too much.
All right. Well, thank you, Bill. Appreciate your time tonight, sir. And we're going to wrap it up with Brent. He is a forecaster just down the road from us in Pleasant Hill, and he's going to be speaking on where you can find IFR forecast information. Brent, controls are yours, sir.
All righty, thank you very much. Thank you for having me this evening. As Joey said, my name is Brent Pesel. I am a meteorologist at the Weather Service in Pleasant Hill, Missouri, which is responsible for the Kansas City area, as well as many forecasts for central and northwest Missouri, as well as far eastern Kansas. So I want to talk a little bit about where we fit in on the WFO level when it comes to the hierarchy of aviation forecasting and what has happened. Okay, there we go. Must have pressed the wrong button. So where do we fit in as the WFO in the hierarchy of aviation forecasting? Well, we're really concerned with basically the local area around the airfield. The WFO puts out the terminal aerodrome forecasts, or the TAFs, which are for around 5 statute miles from the center of the airfield and probably up to around 10 to 15,000 feet. So we really cover basically your takeoff and your landing. And we also write the aviation discussions as part of our overall discussion product. Stepping up, we go to the Center Weather Service units, and they are located within the FAA Air Route Traffic Control Centers. And their primary objective is to work with those air traffic controllers in notifying them what weather hazards are ongoing or forthcoming so that they can route aviation and flights around any sort of weather hazards. You may be more familiar with them as pilots from their center weather advisories. And then moving up to the next level is the Aviation Weather Center, who are responsible for basically very large scale aviation weather forecasting. They're known for their outlooks on the icing as well as turbulence. You know, you're familiar with the AirMets as well as SIGMETs, and they also collaborate with some private partners as far as weather is concerned, and are also responsible for some of the overseas routing, particularly between the United States and Europe. So going on to some aviation weather sources, we've talked about a lot of them, including several different apps and several things like that. I'm going to focus mainly on what the Weather Service provides, and probably the premier site for Weather Service forecasts is the Aviation Weather Center for your aviation needs. So where are some sources that we can get IFR observations, things that are ongoing right now? Of course, the METARs is a great way to learn about what current conditions are happening at the airports. It might be a little bit difficult to see on this map, but the METAR page on the METAR map on the Aviation Weather Center's page, they color code each of the METARs based on the flight categories that are occurring at the airport. So on this small map here, red dots symbolize IFR, the blue dots symbolize NVFR, and green dots are VFR. So there looks like there's a little bit of a IFR area in eastern Indiana and western Ohio on this map. Another source are our satellite products. With the newer GO16, GO17 satellites that were launched a few years ago, we have been granted a whole new wave of satellite products and different ways we can interpret satellite data. This particular image is of the nighttime microphysics color band, which enables us, it's an infrared color band that enables us to see the different heights of clouds, with more of the yellow and white shades being that of lower clouds and possibly fog, which could lead to IFR conditions. This particular image comes from CIRA, or CIRA. They have a satellite page. You can also find another good satellite page at the College of DuPage at weather.cod.edu. And of course, for precipitation, we have the radars that are located at almost all the Weather Service offices. If you do know how to look at higher tilts of the radar, say you have Virga, which is just precipitation not reaching the ground, you can look at those higher tilts as well and see if maybe you'll be encountering some elevated precip as you leave or enter your destination. One of our favorites, of course, are the pilot reports. We love our pilot reports. They help us verify that the activities that are actually going on, or the weather conditions that are actually out there, are what we have forecasted. Basically gives us verification that what we think is happening is actually happening, and it can also help us update forecasts as needed if conditions change. We know as you're flying, conditions change very rapidly sometimes, so pilot reports always help us out. So flipping from ongoing IFR conditions to IFR forecasting, there are several products that are issued by these offices that can help with that. The first one being the TAFs, the Terminal Aerodrome Forecast. These are issued at the Weather Forecast Office level, and each line denotes usually a change in conditions, generally a change in category, or a significant change in wind direction or speed. This one is for North Platte, Nebraska. Looks like it was issued around 2Z, and as we can see, overnight, it looks like we are expecting some IFR conditions to move in with 1.5 statute miles, fog with overcast at 300 feet. Also noting that it looks like it's going to be rather gusty, so it may not be the nicest night to fly into North Platte this particular night. In tandem, we also have the forecast discussions, which are available on every WFO web page. There is an aviation section, generally towards the bottom of that discussion page, and using the aviation discussion in tandem with the TAFs can give you a really good picture of what to expect over the next 24 hours. Generally, the aviation discussions are used to kind of give you a behind-the-scenes look as to what I, the forecaster, am thinking when the TAFs are issued. So, for example, if I'm working on the 18Z, or in this case, noon TAFs, and I'm seeing in the models that maybe we could be seeing some potential fog development the following morning, you know, the guidance may not be super confident, but it is hinting at that possibility. So I will probably keep it out of the actual TAF for the time being, because of course the TAF is mainly concerned, we're mainly put our focus on the first 6 hours and then fill out the rest of the period. But I might go into the discussion and mention that short-term guidance is suggesting that there's a potential for fog development overnight. There's a bit of inconsistency between the guidance, so confidence is a little low in that fog development. This will be updated in future TAFs. So oftentimes, reading those discussions, you can get a good view into the forecaster's brain, into how they came up with that forecast. And of course, on a much bigger level, we have the Sierra Aromets from the Aviation Weather Center, which mainly focus on ceiling and visibility hazards. For example, in this map that is shown, we see a large IFR area due to fog over the Central Plains. So let's dig a little bit deeper. For those who want to be more involved in their weather analysis, we do have a special suite of models that focus on aviation variables, and they are called the LAMP models, or the Localized Aviation MOS program. And these are available via the Model Development Lab, or the MDL. And there are so many variables over this that I'm not going to be able to cover them in the time that we have tonight, but I'll just talk about 2 of the main ones. They do probability graphics. So this graph that is on display now is showing the probability of ceiling heights less than 3,000 feet at Kansas City International. And so the areas that are coded in red show a high chance of those ceilings going below those thresholds, and the bluer colors show less of a chance. In the bottom right is the actual text display, if you want to get into the actual text output of the models. And mainly what you as pilots are going to be concerned with are the areas in the box, which go over your weather type, the cloud coverage, the ceiling, as well as the visibility and any other observations. And it is worth noting that when you are looking at these, that the numbers that are presented there are actually the flight categories. They're not like the height. So when it says ceiling of 6, that means flight category 6, not 6,000 feet. Okay, it's not advancing. There we go. Another great source, probably the best source for your IFR forecasting, and this has been discussed at length throughout this presentation, has been the graphical forecasts for aviation. It is basically a gridded display of aviation forecasts around the country. You can impose your flight plan on there, so put in your starting airport, your destination airport. It will show you the flight plan. There's a little bar up in the top right of that display where you can advance time and see how those weather variables advance across the area or across your flight path. And you can get just about any sort of aviation variable or forecast that you want within the graphical forecast for aviation is a very good tool to use. So there are some other sources outside the Aviation Weather Center as well. If you're looking for high resolution surface maps, the Weather Prediction Center puts out multiple maps a day that are very good for determining the location of highs and lows and fronts and troughs and ridges and other things. And depending on how high off the ground you're flying, the Storm Prediction Center does upper air analysis twice a day, and depending on the direction that you're flying, the jet stream and especially the low-level jet can really affect your flight pattern. So they're also a very good resource as well. And then one more resource for you that you may not know about is the National Weather Service Weather and Hazards Data Viewer. This is a site that allows you to look at METARs in very good detail. Allows you to look at ASOS sites and surface observations. It'll also show you hazards and temperature and a whole lot of other things. But for pilots and the aviation crowd, what I think you'd be most interested in are the ASOS archives and data in there. When you click on a station, the display that's shown on the right side of the slide will show up, and it'll give you the past observations. And the one that you'd most likely be interested in is you can access 5-minute observations within this interface. So a lot of times the METARs update every hour. Many times the METARs will update with special statements and things during any active weather. But say that doesn't happen and you're flying into let's say Olathe at 7:45, but the 7 p.m. METAR says that there's a thunderstorm with gusty winds, and you're looking on your radar and your other apps and other sources of information, and it doesn't look like there's any rain there. You can go into this website and get the 5-minute observations to get the absolute latest update. So that's all I have. I want to thank Joey and Scott and everyone at the AWC for letting me come out, and I will be around for questions. But at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Joey.
All right. Well, thank you, Brent. And I want to let everyone know that if you are interested in becoming a Weather Radio Nation ambassador, we have some source information down there at the bottom, weather.gov/WRN. That will take you to the Weather Radio Nation website for more information. And basically, it's an initiative to inform and protect everyday citizens in schools, businesses, aviation, any enterprise that contends with weather, which is most in some fashion. But there's a lot of, as we've discussed tonight, there's a lot of unknowns with weather hazards, and we have the information to educate and inform, and to be a Weather Radio Nation ambassador is to take part in that, and then to share that information with others to keep them safe as well. So feel free to visit that website for more information regarding that. We want to send a big thank you to all of our presenters tonight, especially our guest presenters. And if you have any questions, feel free to submit those in the chat. Scott, do we have any questions that were unaddressed during the course of the presentation?
All right. Hi, Joey. Sorry about that. Honestly, I think we got to a lot of the questions, but I can kind of go back over some others because I'm sure some in the group would be interested in some of the conversation that we're having on the chat. I guess first and foremost, one of the biggest questions is kind of a housekeeping item. The presentation is being recorded, and we will follow up with a survey in the coming days. As well as an email that will include that YouTube link. So it'll take some time to get the video edited. So look for that video to be uploaded to AWC's YouTube page by early next week. And then also along those lines, you will receive wings credit for this. We've already got your information through GoToWebinar, so we'll send in the information, your email address to the FAST folks to be able to get you wings credit for that. And some of the other questions that we're getting, a really good discussion here as of late regarding some of the slides that Brent shared with respect to the difference with the TAF and the forecast discussion. Oftentimes the TAF is a deterministic forecast, so we're forecasting one thing, whereas we're not allowed to include probabilities for that. So the way that we handle low confidence forecasts, say you're issuing the 0Z TAF for MCI, but you're not very confident about the possibility of morning ground fog or radiation fog. So you could, for 0Z, you could enter a tempo and maybe cover some MVFR fog developing after 9Z. But really by 6Z, maybe you'd have a little bit more confidence to make that a prevailing group. But kind of the way that we handle lower confidence is definitely in that forecast discussion. So it's always good to supplement the TAF with that forecast discussion. The people at the forecasters at the WFOs like Brent are really on top of that. They like to include that uncertainty in that discussion. So always be sure to check that out as well. Some of the other questions, one was, how can I avoid accidentally flying into clouds at night? And really with what Brent shared with that nighttime microphysics satellite, College of DuPage, their satellite page is excellent. So before you fly, if you want to check that out, weather.cod.edu, you can look at that nighttime microphysics and kind of be able to see where the IFR, if it's advection like Jeremiah was talking about, or Bill, you can kind of see the low ceilings advecting into your area. Or just simply infrared, you can kind of see that dark white on the infrared to kind of give you an idea of developing IFR conditions. But honestly, just keeping an eye on the METARs is kind of the best way to go, because you're going to start to see maybe MIFG, some ground fog developing, or visibility is dropping to 6 miles, and then maybe 3 to 5 before dropping even more. Or if it's stratus, you could see if it's kind of if it's VFR and then it's kind of developing into to IFR conditions, you can kind of see in the METARs that ceiling starts to sag slowly downward toward the ground. Or if it develops, you'll start to see maybe a fewer scattered at 400 feet or fewer scattered at 800 feet before it becomes broken or overcast and becomes that true IFR conditions. So that's definitely something that you can keep an eye on. Oftentimes the METAR trends are a great thing to follow, especially if you're in the air, you're listening to the OBS over ADSB or over the VORs or things like that. That's a great way to get that information. Another question was, biggest concerns are winds. What weather products can I use to best inform my decisions to depart and know what the wind is going to be on my way home? You know, what is the best forecast product for that? Hands down, GFA. The graphical forecast for aviation is your go-to for anything, especially within 12 to 15 hours. The link for that at aviationweather.gov/GFA. The great thing about it is when you go to wind on the GFA, on the left side, you're going to have a column that you can stair step up through 3,000, 6,000, 9,000, all the way up to 39,000 for wind speeds. And at those levels, you can easily slide through the hours going into future, or if you want to, there's an observation part as well on the GFA that you can actually go back 12 hours to look at the winds or the METARs or radar satellites. So that's some great helpful information there as well. If you're looking for something a little bit more in depth in the GFA, we've got the wind and temperature aloft, and the link to that is simply aviationweather.gov/windtemp. So that's another resource we have as well. Let me look through here, see if we've got a few other questions. I know we're kind of long on time. Let's see. Oh, there was one question. It was interesting, the TAP that Brent shared. it was showing IFR conditions, but it was showing fog with strong winds. So that was an interesting case. I pulled that one just for that reason alone. So I'm glad that some of you caught that, that you've got IFR and fog in really gusty conditions. I think wind gusts were up to 20, 25 miles per hour. And simply what that was doing is what Jeremiah was talking about, that was increasing the dew point. A nice strong southerly southeasterly flow, raising that dew point. Temperature was dropping just enough that you still had some terrain effects in there as well, some upslope that helped that condense, that moisture condense and actually create relatively long IFR conditions with strong winds. It was mostly ceilings, but there were actually some IFR visibilities in there as well. And I think that terrain component really helped with that as well. So that was a great catch. Let's see. And then another question here, what do trough lines really tell you on the surface chart? What are we concerned with regarding a surface trough? Just simply think as a surface trough as a cold front. Basically, it's going to be a wind shift, but not as strong. You know, you're not going to have the strong gradients in temperature, the strong gradients in dew point per se, but definitely there's some surface forcing going on there, enough of a shift in the winds that you can get some low level lift. So that's what generates that surface trough line on the prog charts. And then how about just one more, if I can find one. There was a question regarding, let's see, the 11 o'clock news talking about morning fog, but it not being in the taps. That simply may be because motorists are looking for a different threshold than pilots. You know, pilots are looking for the NVFR conditions of 3 to 5 statute miles, dropping down the IFR. So it's kind of easy for the news media that they can warn motorists of ground fog, shallow ground fog. It's going to be an impact for vehicles. But it's really, aviation is kind of a different beast when it comes to forecasting. So that's kind of why you may hear a mention on the newscast about some morning fog. But sometimes maybe around the airport it's dry, or they didn't get the rain the night before. So sometimes it might not drop to NVFR, especially to IFR. So that might be part of the reason for the difference. And that's kind of when I encourage you to just go ahead and go back to that forecast discussion and kind of see the differences there. And let's see, I think I maybe talked enough. It's after 8 Central Standard Time. So if you had any more questions in the chat, we'll get to those. We'll get you emailed. We've got your contact information, so we won't leave you hanging.
And I'm going to thank you, Scott, for fielding those questions. I'm going to ask all of our presenters, if you're still here, to come back on camera one more time as we close. Again, we want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I know it's evening and it's a busy time of year, but we appreciate your time. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving and stay safe this winter season. The hazards are real and they will be present for motorists and pilots. So stay safe. Scott, you may have mentioned there will be a survey coming. So yes, keep an eye out for that. And also we're going to post this entire session on YouTube within the next week. So keep an eye out for that too. If you had to step out or if you want to reference it some other time, it'll be available for you. So if anybody has anything else they want to add, feel free to. Otherwise, we'll probably do another one of these in the spring timeframe. Scott's shaking his head. So keep an eye out for that notification. Does anyone have anything else?
Just a huge thank you to Paul and Mark for joining us tonight. This was great. Thank you both.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you all, presenters and attendees. Have a great night and a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you all.